Welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, and welcome to this event, co-hosted by the Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs, which is a new non-profit research-focused organization based in Washington, DC, and IWPR, based in Central Asia. First of what we hope to be a series of events that we organize together. And today's event is on a very topical theme of vaccine diplomacy, regionalism and geopolitical influence in Central Asia. Globally, I think a year into the pandemic, we're hopefully turning a corner as the various vaccines around the world are being rolled out and distributed. This is also true in Central Asia, where last month we saw vaccines being rolled out in different countries in the region. But today we're going to dig into some of the political implications of the choice of different vaccines by different countries in the region, what this says about the influence of external players in Central Asia, what this says about regionalism in Central Asia. And so we've assembled an all-star panel to focus and explore this issue with us today. But before we turn it over to the panel and we hear from them, I'm going to turn over to my friend Abakhan Sultan Nazarov, who is the regional director at IWPR Central Asia.
Thank you very much, Edward. Dear ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight at the IWPR Central Asia and the Oxus Society online discussion. First of all, let me express my gratitude to our trusted old and who we know for many years. We have been cooperating with him and now with the Oxus Society, and time again, we find our cooperation fruitful and beneficial for us, for the expert community, and for all Central Asia. So thus, we are very honored and proud to be holding this event tonight. Conducting a discussion about the challenges faced by our Central Asian region allows us to bring together international experts and experienced analysts, and to hear their opinions on the existing problem and hear possible solutions. Such a practice allows for cross-fertilization and generation of unique new ideas. So today we'll talk about the most timely and acute question: vaccination and geopolitics around it. While conquering the virus is the most important goal for every country nowadays, big powers and powerful actors tend to compete and increase their influence. So this requires countries of Central Asia to navigate through the new power play, and thorough analysis is needed. Hence, we are here today to listen, to discuss, and ask questions from our distinguished panel of speakers. I hope today our invited experts can guide us through this important topic and provide a detailed accounts of the politics around the COVID-19 vaccinations. I really look forward to a fruitful discussion, and thank you very much for your attention. Edward, back to you, please.
Thank you, Abakhan. We share your excitement about the event, and I hope it's going to be a fruitful and interesting discussion for everyone who's attending. If you have a question whilst we're hearing from the speakers, if something comes into your mind at the time they're speaking, please type it into the chat. Afterwards, we will have some time for Q&A. I'm going to ask that the speakers try and keep their remarks to under 8 minutes so that we have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. But first, we're going to hear from Professor Alexander Cooley, who is the Claire Tao Professor of Political Science at Barnard College in New York and the Director of the Harriman Institute at Columbia University. His most important affiliation, of course, is that he's on the advisory council of the Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs. So we're delighted to have Alex with us today, and he's going to take us through the vaccine diplomacy and the international relations of vaccines at a global level.
Thanks so much, Ed. Thank you. Abakhan, thank you, IWPR and Oxus. It's a pleasure to be with you. I have a few slides, so I'm going to share my screen, and here we go. Hopefully we've all become semi-competent at this. I will never describe myself as competent. Okay, so Ed has asked me to talk a little bit in general about the international politics, international relations. I won't mention Central Asia too much, but hopefully we will see some themes emerge that are very relevant to Central Asia and a few examples that are relevant to Central Asia. We see a lot about this idea that COVID-19, especially vaccine diplomacy, is becoming a geopolitical tool, a geopolitical weapon in the battle for global influence, particularly amongst emerging countries, Russia and China. India is mentioned sometimes, and the sort of diminishing influence of the West and the liberal international order. This is a typical headline, and this is a piece in Bloomberg that tells us Russia and China are beating the West at vaccine diplomacy, right? While the West hoards its COVID jabs like rocket fuel, Russia and China are deploying them strategically around the world, which gives us the sense that, vaccine diplomacy, COVID jabs are an instrument of influence. And I want to interrogate that a little bit and complicate that in today's presentation, not because I don't think it's important, but because I think there are some nuances. I want to talk actually about three mechanisms through which I think vaccine development and diplomacy can possibly impact international relations. The first is this tension between vaccine nationalism and inequality, and whether the system of global governance and cooperation that we have can solve it, right? Can solve it effectively. Second, perceptions of competence in dealing with COVID and vaccine vaccine administration. And third, the specific issue of collective or public goods and using vaccines in those ways as influences. So the first is simply we have a situation where vaccine nationalism, that is rich countries hoarding vaccines taken for themselves, are going to leave poor countries behind, right? And this was a controversial map that was put out by The Economist last month that shows that according to their estimates, many countries in the developing world are not going to receive the vaccines until late 2022 or 2023. We're not going to have full vaccinations until then. This was disputed. Actually, some of the Sputnik people disputed this, but this is sort of, one of the initial kind of prognostications. What's the problem? The problem is that rich countries, Canada, United States, UK, European Union, it's not very clear here on the left, pre-ordered a bunch of vaccine, multiple times their population size, right? In Canada, it's 500 times population size. In the US, it was 200. Excuse me. In the EU, it was 300, though they've had, also 200, and they had problems rolling out. In the UK, it was 300. And then other countries, and if you go all the way down, you'll see upper middle income and lower middle income did not take those same steps, right? They did not pre-order or reach these contractual deals. So we have a problem. As a result, the international community has put together this COVAX program, which is led by WHO, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. And the idea here is to pool procurement and deliver 2 billion doses of vaccines to poorer countries by the end of 2021. 183 countries have joined this, including China, Japan, the EU. The US and Russia initially ruled out joining. The US has since joined from the Biden administration. Russia has indicated it'll participate in a small way since. So this is the main mechanism, this COVAX mechanism. The problem is that deliveries have been very slow from COVAX. And as well, there's an interesting case from Kyrgyzstan that perhaps you can talk more about internally, where health minister last month said that the Pfizer coronavirus vaccine that was going to come to Kyrgyzstan does not fit Kyrgyzstan. Why? Because it has to be stored at a very low temperature, sub 70 degrees Celsius. And although there were 1.2 million doses offered, the refrigerator cost would be prohibitively high, and Kyrgyzstan doesn't have the freezer, so they would need $2 million more for the vaccine. They don't have funds in the budget. This then leads to talks over acquiring Sputnik. The point about this story, though, it encapsulates this idea of sort of inequality in the vaccine system, but also the global governance system being, incompetent, right? Not listening to the needs of countries like Kyrgyzstan, taking steps unilaterally, and not having their ear on the ground to have a good local solution. My second mechanism, so that's the global governance of inequality and vaccine nationalism. The second mechanism is competence. Look, how countries manage the epidemic is a form of soft power. It is a form of authority that they have. Initially, over the summer, we saw very bad marks for the United States, quite good marks for the EU, but also actually bad marks for China. And this is just some data from the Pew survey taken over the summer, sort of, that found that both China and the US have been perceived as doing a very bad job at handling the pandemic. And these are polls of 14 countries in the developed world. US was really bad, 84%, but China was really bad too, right? At sort of 61%. So if this was the moment in which China was going to rise and overtake the US because of its competence, it hasn't happened, right? But I also think that we have now moved to a new metric. And the new metric is who can deliver vaccine doses effectively. Despite all the deaths that we have had in the US, 500,000, I think this is the metric that now we're seeing more and more invoked in public diplomacy as to how effective a particular country is. And on this metric, how many vaccine doses administered per 100 people, who's ahead? Israel. Israel's vaccinated everyone, right? UAE. UK is doing very well in vaccine rollout, even though they were perceived as quite incompetent when Johnson sort of initially went the herd immunity route last spring. And the US is doing pretty well too. It's administering 2 million doses. Who's not doing well? European Union is not doing well, right? Based on the data, China and Russia internally too, although there are more problems there. So my point is, perceptions of how countries deal are very fluid. And I think we are going to remember the last metric as opposed to the summer metric. So these perceptions of competence, I think, also matter. But let me talk about what we really are going to be focusing on, this idea that vaccines are collective goods, right? And that emerging powers who provide vaccines as collective goods can then wield influence. President Xi Jinping says this quite openly. He says China's virus vaccine will be a global public good. It's not a global public good because you have to pay for it, right? So it's not in the standard definition, but it is a collective good. And it is an attempt to translate, just like with development assistance or investment, the provision of goods in exchange for influence. Yeah. So how might we think about this? Well, again, you see kind of, this is just from Axios a couple of days ago. Latin America turns to China and Russia for COVID-19 vaccines. Will this amount to geopolitical influence? I would say there's very little evidence for this. So when China this time last year started rolling out medical goods diplomacy to countries like Italy and Spain, all around the world, 150 countries, you saw as many negative stories as positive stories about the Chinese efforts, right? The negative focused on China's wily intentions, on the shoddy quality of the goods involved, on how it was trying to push its Belt and Road Initiative and pry EU countries from the EU. So I would say, with a couple of exceptions, it wasn't particularly effective. But what vaccine diplomacy does do, it plays into existing regional and global agendas. It offers another tool. So in China, vaccine diplomacy is another good offered in these BRI Health Silk Route Cooperation bundles. It's usually bundled with other goods, private and club goods. And for Russia, the development of Sputnik, you can see them targeting areas that the West has not reached, countries that are ambivalent as being part of the liberal international order. It's not cheaper, even though they pretend that it is. And it enhances Russian prestige. It's often used as a diplomatic lever, and it is also now being bundled in the Eurasian Economic Union agenda, right? So there is a place for vaccine diplomacy, but it is operating within these agendas. So let me give you an example from the Philippines. Their vaccine diplomacy has been integrated as a goods package for the Philippines, promise of 500,000 doses in addition to 1.3 billion loan pledges for infrastructure and grants to that country. My final point, though, is all this might be true. We might have effective geopolitics, but there are three areas, I would argue, of domestic politics that will also affect how this plays out on the ground. First is the preference for multi-vectorism and hedging suppliers. We all know Central Asian countries practice multi-vector diplomacy, but honestly, when it comes to vaccines, every competent government should practice multi-vector diplomacy. Why? You don't want to be reliant on any one supplier. You don't want any one supplier to have complete political leverage over you. So multi-vectorism when it comes to vaccines should be axiomatic. And you've seen this. And so these slides that Latin America is procuring from China, is procuring from Russia, well, they're procuring from everywhere, most of these countries, right? Maybe the Turkmen example in Central Asia is different with an exclusive deal for Sputnik, but you should be going in multiple places. Two, what I see is that certain political elites and parties usually disposed to what I call multipolar politics, right? Signaling their intent to cooperate with Russia or China, are using vaccine diplomacy in that service. Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, in that picture is getting a Chinese vaccine, and he's making a public showing of it. But he's always touted the importance of Chinese cooperation as a way of taking a dig at the EU. This isn't changing his agenda, right? So I'm also sort of skeptical this is changing minds. I'm not sure, maybe, but let's see more data. And then my final point is, you may have heard this term, we're not only in a pandemic, we're in an infodemic. The amount of misinformation surrounding vaccines, whether it's personal harm, origin, all of this is also going to flood the zone, and I think is going to mediate and filter any kind of geopolitical influence. Is there even a guarantee that people are going to know what jab that they're taking, right? Or that they're going to know accurately who has procured for what? So I do think domestic politics is a big part of the story too. So all this to say is, vaccine diplomacy is real. It's another tool. It's very high profile. And in some cases, the contracts are big. So I don't mean to minimize the stakes, but is it a game changer on its own? I'm a little more skeptical, but I'm really looking forward to seeing what my colleagues have to say about Central Asia in particular. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dr. Cooley, for that fantastic overview. Lots of food for thought that hopefully we can unpack in the upcoming presentations and maybe further in the Q&A. So next, we're going to turn to Dr. Parviz Mullajanov, who is a visiting researcher at the School of Advanced Studies in Social Sciences, HESS in Paris. And he is going to give his thoughts on the impact that COVID-19, the vaccine diplomacy, vaccine rollout is having on regionalism, regional relations in Central Asia. Parviz, do we still, maybe he's dropped off the call. If Parviz has disappeared, then maybe we can turn next, and hopefully he can rejoin us. We can turn next instead to Judy Twigg, who is a professor of political science at Virginia Commonwealth University, where she teaches courses on global health and with a particular focus on Eurasia. So she's going to take us through the Sputnik vaccine and some of Russia's vaccine diplomacy in Central Asia. So Judy, if you don't mind speaking, then we will turn to you.
Thanks very much, Ed, for that introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to share some thoughts with such an excellent, distinguished audience. Obviously, there's no more urgent and timely subject than the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, the arena right now where we're hearing about things is in vaccines and vaccine diplomacy. So I'll share some thoughts about Russia, which I follow most closely. In terms of vaccine diplomacy, Russia was clearly the first country in the world out of the gate. We all know that Sputnik V, V for victory, was the first COVID vaccine in the world to be approved by a national government back in August of 2020. And that approval came with great fanfare. The fact that the vaccine's website was launched in 7 languages, I think tells us everything we need to know about the intended audience for Sputnik V. It wasn't just domestic, it was a global audience that they were aiming for. Sputnik V is now registered in more than 40 countries. They added Sri Lanka to the list this morning, and it's hard to keep up because the number of countries that have approved Sputnik V increases every day. There has been special interest in the Latin American countries in Sputnik V and particular headway with European Union members in Eastern Europe. Hungary began administering Sputnik V about 2 weeks ago. The Czech Republic intends to move forward. Slovakia has approved it. There are conversations with Austria. And this is all without Sputnik V having yet been approved by the European regulator, the European Medicines Agency. So this is extraordinary. Although this morning we have word that the European Medicines Agency announced that it's beginning a formal review of Sputnik V. It's likely to be officially approved by the EU soon. So the developer of Sputnik V, the Gamaleya Institute in Moscow, should be congratulated for its scientific achievement. The vaccine was confirmed last month as safe and highly effective in a peer-reviewed publication in The Lancet, one of the world's leading medical journals. Sputnik V has been rolled out widely across Russia. It's very easy to get vaccinated in Moscow, wide availability in clinics across the country. In fact, if you go to GUM, the luxury department store right off of Red Square, you can get free ice cream along with your jab. So in Moscow and in other parts of Russia, it appears actually that supply of Sputnik V outstrips demand. And we can talk about that later if you'd like. It looks like there is substantial vaccine hesitancy in Russia. There are many COVID deniers in Russia, many people who are anti-vaccine in general, and certainly many people who don't trust specifically the Sputnik V vaccine in Russia. But that's the domestic situation in Russia. Let's talk internationally. Internationally, in terms of exercising soft power through the provision, or at least the offer of provision of vaccines, Russia got off to a head start. Russia was aggressively marketing Sputnik V well before any of the Western vaccines had cleared regulatory approval. Many countries now have deals to get Sputnik V doses straight from Russia. There are many more deals that have been set up to receive Sputnik V doses that have been manufactured somewhere else, especially in India. And there are many other countries that are cutting deals to receive the formula and technology for Sputnik V from Russia so that they can make the vaccine themselves. So what are Russia's goals here? I think Russia has three goals with Sputnik V. First of all, Sputnik V is obviously a symbol of Russia's return to great power status. It's about pride, it's about national stature, it's about respect. Being the first in the world to blaze the trail for the way out of a once-in-a-century global pandemic puts Russia back on the map, in their view, as a great scientific and technological power. And they portray Sputnik V this way quite deliberately. If you think back to when Sputnik V was first approved in August, for the first couple of weeks that the Sputnik V website was set up, it had a feature where it took a couple of seconds for the site to load. There was a built-in delay. And during that delay, you were encouraged to push a button on the screen and turn your sound all the way up. And when you pushed that button, what you got was the audio of the beeps that we heard broadcast from space back in 1957, when the first Soviet Sputnik satellite, the first man-made object in space, when that satellite was launched. So that was a hallmark moment for Soviet superiority in the space race. It is no accident that they're evoking that moment now, even using the name Sputnik for the vaccine. Secondly, clearly Russia wants to exercise soft power with this vaccine. Poor and middle income countries, as Alex pointed out, are desperate for access to vaccines. Russia realizes or hopes that there is diplomatic benefit from appearing as a savior during this unprecedented global crisis. And in particular, again, as Alex pointed out, Russia is contrasting its own generosity against the perceived selfishness of the United States, Canada, European countries that have gobbled up all of the available doses of Pfizer, Moderna, some of the other European vaccines through these pre-purchase agreements. The rich countries have pre-purchased enough vaccine to cover their own populations several times over, leaving the rest of the world with nothing. This has happened before. Think back to the early years with antiretroviral medications for HIV/AIDS. Rich countries got them all years before millions of dying people got them in sub-Saharan Africa. So Russia is very anxious to highlight these historical and current inequities. Last, but certainly not least, for Russia, this is a business opportunity. COVID vaccines are a multi-billion-dollar business, and Russia clearly wants to maximize market share here. They're offering Sputnik V at about $20 for the full course of 2 doses. As Alex said, that's not necessarily cheaper than some of the other alternatives that are emerging, but it is quite a bit cheaper than Pfizer or Moderna, the more innovative mRNA vaccines. So I think there's a longer term set of business interests here. Russia has not traditionally been much of a player on global pharmaceutical markets, and clearly they'd like this vaccine to be a wedge to get other countries to consider buying other drugs from Russia as well. So there's a lot Russia would like to achieve with Sputnik V, but there are some important caveats here when thinking about how likely it is that Russia is achieving these goals or is likely to achieve these goals. First is that the way Russia has proceeded hasn't exactly inspired confidence. Both international consumers and Russian consumers have legitimate lingering doubts about Sputnik V because of the way Sputnik V was approved before it had even entered large-scale phase 3 clinical trials. Russia put the cart way before the horse. There's a perception, and it's a correct perception, that development was rushed, that Sputnik V kind of skipped the line, so to speak. It didn't go through a full scientific and regulatory vetting because there was so much top-down political pressure for Russia to be first in the vaccine race. And there was a fear that this may have impacted the vaccine's safety and quality. Now, this is a gamble they took, a huge gamble they took that paid off. You know, that we now know that the vaccine is safe and effective, but it was a tremendous risk. There was reputational risk. If they had launched the vaccine with all this fanfare and then it hadn't worked, or if there had been incidents of people who were harmed by the vaccine because it wasn't safe, thank goodness that didn't happen, but there was tremendous reputational risk involved. There was also public health risk. What if people had taken Sputnik V, thought they were protected, and then spread the virus because they stopped wearing masks or stopped practicing social distancing? Or what if Sputnik V hadn't worked and that had had an overall negative impact on people's trust in vaccines, depressed people's willingness to get vaccinated, even with the good vaccines that are out there? So there's still a lot about this accelerated development and approval timetable that has left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. It's depressed trust in the vaccine. Second, because Russia's efforts were able to achieve such a visibility with Sputnik V largely because the traditional global health powers, the United States, Western Europe, they had essentially withdrawn from the global health space. This is especially an issue with the United States and the Trump administration. Obviously, there was a vacuum left by the American abandonment of global health institutions and responsibility. This predates the COVID-19 pandemic. This goes back to the early days of the Trump administration's America First policies. And so from an international perspective, President Trump's selfish policies, leaving World Health Organization, refusing to join or contribute to COVAX, this left a clear opening for Russia to realize those initial soft power gains with Sputnik V. And so the key question now is whether or not that vacuum that was created by the absence of the United States, whether that vacuum is receding, whether or not Russia's golden moment, when it was the only game in town, when its vaccine generosity was generating all the headlines, is that golden moment being supplanted? Is it being nudged aside by COVAX, the global vaccine facility that Alex described, and by other bilateral deals that are now emerging for poor and middle income countries? So a couple of points here. One is that there was a moment not too long ago when it appeared that COVAX might never get off the ground. You know, the Trump administration wasn't contributing. Globally, contributions to it were anemic. But it's clear now that that COVAX has been launched and its deliveries are accelerating literally with each passing day. The Biden administration has pledged $2 billion to COVAX right off the bat. $2 billion more are on the table if matching funds materialize from other donors. It's very clear that COVAX is going to be the centerpiece for low and middle income country access to vaccines throughout the rest of 2021 and into 2022. And I'll note that Russia has chosen not to participate in COVAX in any major way. It's not a donor of funds, and it's chosen not to have Sputnik V as part of the COVAX portfolio of vaccines. Russia has said specifically that it prefers to transmit Sputnik V through the kinds of bilateral deals that it's been making. Second point I'll make here is to echo something that Alex said earlier, that most countries that have taken delivery of Sputnik V have diversified their vaccine portfolios. And of course they should have done this and should be doing this. They are not exclusively reliant on Russia. So one key question here is, how long are everyone's memories? How long do people remember the Trump administration's selfishness? How long do they remember Russia's initial exclusivity in the realm of vaccine diplomacy? How much do they remember the scientific gamble that Russia took with the premature approval of Sputnik V? And how quickly can the Biden administration return to this space? How much does the newfound goodwill for Russia exist in places that will be particularly useful in the longer term? And that brings us to Central Asia. Others know more specifically about Central Asia than I do, so I'll just make a few quick points. One is that Russia has a clear interest in getting the Central Asian countries vaccinated because it needs migrant labor from Central Asia to return to Russia. As the Russian economy picks back up, there's a growing labor shortage in Russia in drivers, construction, delivery services. And so that labor mobility is something that Russia is very interested in seeing return. There are also political motives. Russia is clearly making a play to counter Chinese influence in the region. This is Russia's own backyard traditionally. Central Asia has been one of the few places where Russia has sold other kinds of vaccines over recent decades, other pharmaceutical products. So we said before, all 5 Central Asian countries have registered Sputnik V or are talking with Russia, but none are counting exclusively on Russia. And I'll point here especially to Kazakhstan, which started mass vaccination back on February 1st using Sputnik V, but Kazakhstan was also the first country in the world a couple of weeks ago to announce that it will start local production of Sputnik V. And I'll note importantly that this is also in addition to Kazakhstan's own COVID vaccine. So very important in terms of the Central Asian vaccine landscape. I'll also note that there are other donors active in Central Asia, especially no one's mentioned yet the multilateral development banks. The Asian Development Bank just announced a $9 billion COVID vaccine initiative. Extraordinary because ADB usually doesn't have health as a very big part of its portfolio. And the World Bank just announced a $12 billion vaccine effort. And Tajikistan is one of the first 4 countries to get financing there. Some of this money from the multilateral development banks is going through COVAX. Some is going to support countries to buy vaccines through bilateral arrangements. And importantly, much of it is going to support logistics and capacity building for vaccine administration. So Alex mentioned before that Kyrgyzstan had to turn away from the Pfizer vaccine because of the cold storage requirements. It's that kind of hurdle, logistical hurdle, that the multilateral development bank money and increasingly USAID money and some other bilateral donor money is intended to help overcome. It's a pretty good bet that none of this multilateral development bank money is going toward Russia or going towards Sputnik V. So the big picture here, just to conclude, the most important perspective, taking a step back, is that we just need as many good vaccines as we can get deployed as quickly as we can deploy them, no matter where they come from. And in that sense, it's somewhat unfortunate that the tenor of the conversation is so much about competition rather than about collaboration. And Russia makes this statement all the time. You know, Russia makes the point about, we just want good vaccine and can't we all rise above politics? But this is a little disingenuous since Russia is making this statement in the exact same breath as it's touting the superiority of its own product and engaging in a little bit of disinformation about the Western alternatives. Central Asia clearly is emerging as one of the most important arenas for this diplomatic competition. And I thank you for the opportunity to contribute some thoughts and look forward to learning more from the other speakers. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Twigg, for that overview of of Russia's multifaceted efforts in this regard. I think next we'll logically turn to Timur Umarov, who is a consultant at the Carnegie Moscow Center and an expert on China's Central Asia relations, who's going to take us through China's vaccine diplomacy. And then hopefully we'll turn to Parviz at the end to talk about some of the regional implications. So Timur, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I would start by saying that although Russia was the first to announce that it registered the vaccine, China was the first to start working on the vaccines, and it was first to, register a COVID case, and it had much more time to do that. And already in September 2020, all across the country, medical workers, border inspectors, members of the military, other governmental employees, and even Huawei employees have access to domestically developed vaccines that were still going under the clinical trials. So for a long time, China has been not publicly having those trials, and today, actually last week, 2 more domestic developed vaccines applied for public rollouts, and one of them is a single dose shot vaccine. And plus to that, there are also other 5 vaccines that are undergoing clinical trials in China. Taking into consideration all of that effort and resources that China has, it seems very unusual that the numbers of domestic rollout of the vaccines in China are very slow. Of course, there are a bunch of different reasons. From China has the biggest population in the world. There is a high vaccine hesitancy in the society, but it seems that at the moment Beijing doesn't have to rush its vaccination campaign, because we see that the virus is more or less under control. There is no sense of urgency among the population to get vaccinated. So China uses all of its vaccine producing capacity to roll out its vaccine diplomacy campaign. And here, Chinese vaccines have several advantages in contrast to the Western vaccines, to Pfizer and Moderna, for example. They don't have to be, they don't require extra cold storage. And it makes distribution a little bit easier, and the new registered single dose Chinese vaccine is an attractive competitor to Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and that is why some of the countries are preferring to go to China to get its vaccines. And at the same time, as Alex pointed out, US and Europe are not, remain kind of not so active in efforts to vaccinate the majority of world population, and China and Xi Jinping himself told in May 2020 that these Chinese vaccines are for the humanity, and this is a global public good, which is not exactly a public good, but in minds of Chinese government officials, it is. And we've seen that in several months, China has been one of the leading countries to export its vaccines. Recently, Wall Street Journal had a piece on Ethiopia case where the governmental official told that Chinese vaccines are arriving at a rate of 1 million a week. And on the one hand, it shows that China is very successful in its vaccine diplomacy, but on the other hand, there are many questions on whether it is the real intention of China to help develop countries, or another instrument to use in its favor to rise its reputation across the world, and to use it as a another tool to making China great again, to make China a great power as other great powers in the world. But also there are questions about China's, about the quality of the Chinese vaccines. There are different reports on different Chinese vaccines that have a huge range of the efficacy of Chinese vaccines, and this range starts sometimes at 50%. And it's not comparable to those of other countries. If we move to Central Asia, we would see that China has started its talks about trials in Central Asia and then exporting to Central Asia of the vaccines in summer 2020. And it had so 3 producers, according to the information in the news, 3 producers have been talking with the governments of Central Asia. It's Sinovac, Sinopharm, and Anhui Zhifei companies. And only the 3rd company have successfully negotiated the trials in Uzbekistan, and interestingly, Uzbekistan was the only and the most open to Chinese COVID diplomacy among other Central Asian states. On the one hand, it's understandable because compared to other Central Asian states, Uzbekistan is less dependent on China, and the society in Uzbekistan is less skeptical towards Chinese products as a whole. And now we see that Russia is leading this battle, if you want, over the Central Asian vaccine diplomacy, and all other Central Asian states, and Uzbekistan as well, have negotiated and talks with Russia to get Sputnik V. And except for Uzbekistan, no other Central Asian state had got the Chinese versions. And here, the reason for that is very understandable. It's different for different countries. All in all, I think it's true to say that all Central Asian societies are skeptical towards the quality of Chinese produced goods. And in addition to that, Chinese policy in Xinjiang region and the Chinese reputation in Central Asia overall has a big impact on that. And there was a survey in Central Asia Barometer saying that, proving that a lot of the majority of the populations of Central Asian states were thinking that Russia is the best solution for the to go through COVID-19 crisis, whether less than 10% of those who were participating in the survey thought that China is the best. And I would be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Timo, for that overview of China's efforts and interesting comparisons with Russia and the other countries. So hopefully Parviz has returned and he can speak to regionalism and some of the maybe local vaccine efforts that have been talked about briefly, particularly in Kazakhstan. So Parviz, if you're with us, then the floor is yours. I think you're muted, Parviz. Parviz, you're muted. You're muted. Parviz, you're muted. Okay, well.
Okay, now.
Okay.
So
perfect.
Yeah. Sorry, I have to apologize for these connection problems. We have some repair works in the area, therefore it's not so stable. My task today is to discuss the issue of vaccination, the geopolitical aspects of vaccination problems in Central Asia, through the angle of the Central Asians themselves, how they consider, how they regard this situation. And I would say that Central Asian countries today face a rather complicated challenge. They have to select one of the available choices for the upcoming vaccination of population. Of course, the major debates were in the beginning of autumn last year. By the fall of 2020, now already at least a larger part of decisions have been made. However, there are still some questions and issues to be raised and discussed. There are three closely interrelated factors that affect the final decisions of the Central Asian governments. First of all, there is, as it was mentioned many times today, the external or geopolitical group of cluster of factors. This is mainly the choice between Russia, China, and Europe, which are actually the major geopolitical actors and players in the region. So it's not really more the choice or selection of the types of different vaccines, but actually the selection of the major political partners for the future to some extent. There are three choices also, several vaccines. There is Sputnik 1, the two Russians, as it was mentioned today, The major one is Sputnik V. There is 3 Chinese, and then there is a German one and a British AstraZeneca. Geopolitical aspects are perceived by both sides. First of all, as it was also mentioned today, for the external players, this is the matter of prestige. This is an instrument of future influence to ensure future influence and strengthen society, strengthen their position in the country. This is opportunity for the future as well. I mean, to enter into the local medical and pharmaceutical sectors. And also, this is the issue of security, which was also discussed both in Russian, first of all, in the Russian mass media, the issue of security, by saying that you cannot stop corona on the borders, and therefore we have to ensure that in the countries which are in good relation with us, we have cooperation, close cooperation with those countries, we have flow of people coming from those countries. They have to ensure that there would be no corona. First of all, meaning the post-Soviet countries, so-called Ближнее зарубежье. There is also the issue, the matter of future benefits for locals. They can, this is a good opportunity for them to ensure better terms for future cooperation, to get some new economic proposals and opportunities for instance, for Tajikistan, if Tajikistan decided to join the Eurasian Economic Union, and also for Uzbekistan, which is going to join probably. And also some opportunities for local industries, because they expect some investments from Russia, for instance, in local factories, but it's actually happening in Kazakhstan. So this is actually the field of trade-offs, of ongoing trade-offs between the countries. The second cluster is the economic reasons, the economic factors. This is also, we discussed it today, this is the cost of, in terms of vaccine delivery, the cost of vaccine, the cost of vaccination, the conditions for maintaining the delivered vaccine. The cost of delivery is still not clear. I mean, there are different figures about the cost of Sputnik, the cost of European vaccine also, I mean, it differs. And some of them would be delivered free of charge. And there are also some information that they would be delivered on some lower cost, but there would be some cost anyway. Another issue, which is also somewhere between the geopolitical interest, geopolitical issue aspects and economic issue and aspect, this is, I referred to vaccination passport issue, which was also discussed in local media and social network. This is the idea that, I mean, if, for instance, the European countries decided to adopt the decree on vaccination passport, so the vaccination passport would be introduced in the European Union. In this case, some vaccines, for instance, Chinese vaccine that would not be approved in the European Union would not be allowed. So people who use this vaccine, they will not get a vaccination passport. Therefore, they will not be allowed to travel to Europe. There is also a possibility, some alleged possibility that even in Russia, if there would be such restrictions, if some of Chinese vaccine would not be approved in Russia, would not be certified in Russia. So it means that Central Asian people who use those vaccines would not be also allowed to travel to Russia. There are also these third cluster of factors. This is the local population and public opinion perceptions, how people regard the different options. This is, first of all, the level of trust to a particular vaccine, a particular country. As it was mentioned, according to opinion polls, there is much less trust to Chinese providers, Chinese medical products. Therefore, the governments have to take it into account. There is also a lower level of trust to the whole idea of vaccination in general, which could be traced to the previous times. It's not only about the vaccination against corona, but it's actually the long story for Central Asia. There is always some mistrust towards vaccination, not only among even religious groups of people, but in general in the society. There is also some contradictory impact on the local propaganda, especially in the countries like Tajikistan, because Tajikistan for many months tries to convince the people that the COVID issue is solved in the country. There is no problem anymore in Tajikistan, and therefore there is a kind of contradictory situation, because people could say that yes, of course, if there is no COVID in the country, why we need to have a vaccination? So to some degree, the government itself becomes the victim of its own propaganda, because now the government has to convince people that the vaccination is needed. So in general, it was, as it was mentioned, the Russians proved to be much more successful in pushing forward their options in Central Asia. And I just give you a brief overview of that, the current situation with vaccination. In Kazakhstan, as it was mentioned, the Sputnik V vaccine, the vaccination started from the 1st of February. There is also its own production envisaged. The local COVID also would be probably delivered by the end of April. The government of Kazakhstan announced recently, I mean, it was in the end of January, that it is not going to purchase the Chinese vaccine. Although there are still some discussions about this possibility. The Kyrgyzstan, they would have AstraZeneca. I mean, already 500,000 doses of vaccine delivered in February. The 500,000 of Sputnik is going to be delivered. There are some negotiations with China. In Uzbekistan, the Sputnik is approved. There is some joint authorship with China. There is a vaccine which already registered in Uzbekistan. There are some vaccine probably delivered in the future through the COVAX opportunities. In Turkmenistan, there would be Sputnik and Epivac Corona. It's already also registered. This is a Russian vaccine. In Tajikistan, there would be COVAX. The Tajikistani government applied for 2 million doses, which would cover 20% of the population. There would be on no commercial prices, so we don't think that they would be free of charge. And the rest would be covered by Sputnik. And there is also ongoing negotiations concerning Sputnik. So as I mentioned, I mean, for Tajikistan, it's also the problem of its own propaganda. I mean, they now told everyone there is no COVID. So if there is no COVID, many even government people within the government believe that, so we don't have COVID, so why we have to have a vaccination? So this is what I wanted to say. So I would be glad to answer the questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Molojanov. So we still have a little bit of time for questions. So the first, we've had a couple of questions in the chat. Some of them are interrelated. Some of them we've already alluded to, but maybe some of the panelists can expand on them a little. The first is from Miras, and he's asking specifically about the Kazakh vaccine that a number of you have spoken about. So if one of you wants to talk a little bit about Kazakhstan's, or the prospect of Kazakhstan, becoming a player in vaccine diplomacy within Central Asia, exporting the vaccine to other countries, what are the prospects of that? What would be the motivations for doing that? So that's the first sort of question. And then we have two questions that are sort of interrelated from Mizohid and from Mirim. And they're both sort of speaking to some of the themes that Parviz has just mentioned in terms of, the fact that, the case numbers are going down in Central Asia. The region itself seemingly didn't see the same level of a second wave that we saw in other parts of the world. And obviously the need for vaccinations doesn't chime with some of the discourse, particularly coming from Turkmenistan and Tajikistan, denying the existence of the virus in the country anymore. So they're sort of both asking questions around the extent to which elites themselves are benefiting, what role does corruption play in this, with elites specifically benefiting either financially or symbolically from vaccine rollout. So I don't know who wants to take those questions. I unfortunately have to leave and go to another event. So I'm going to turn over the moderation from here in to Ermik Baisalov, who is the editor at CABAR, at IWPR, CABAR, Central Asia. So in terms of the first set of questions, I don't know if Professor Cooley, maybe you want to start.
I'll just make a brief comment that I think for any country to engage in vaccine diplomacy, and Kazakhstan is one of them, has to be part of a broader agenda. So really the question is, what would Kazakhstan like to accomplish regionally vis-a-vis the other countries or its partners, that it would use vaccines in this bundle of engagement. And so I would think of it in those terms analytically anyway. But I think there are a lot more knowledgeable people here about the state of the Kazakh vaccines themselves.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ermik. So today I'm helping Edward with the moderating questions and answers session. So let me continue with the question from Miras. As Professor Cooley said, there may be someone from the region, let's say Timur or Dr. Molojanov can answer the question. Is there any opportunity for any type of non-Russian participating schemes to deliver the vaccine across the Central Asia, competing with all of the great powers in vaccine diplomacy in the region?
You mean non-Russians, meaning that European or American or what?
Probably he is asking about the Western or let's say the Asian vaccine.
I mean, the problem with it was also discussed today that American vaccine is not really convenient in terms of maintenance. Also the European ones are much more expensive. So the only way to get them actually through the some loans and some opportunities given provided by international organizations like ADB or COVAX, etc. Otherwise, I don't think that the local countries would be able to buy it. It would be too expensive. So as it was shown in the list, I have demonstrated today that the majority of vaccines delivered, which would be delivered, which plan to be delivered to Central Asia, they would come through the COVAX.
Thank you. Dear Timur, do you have something to add?
Yes, I would add that unfortunately, Russia becomes for Central Asia the only good option in terms of vaccine, because as Parviz and Alex already said, that Western vaccines are expensive, not because of the price, but because of the transportation. And going to China brings a lot of risks with it, because on the one hand, you have the society that is with high anti-China sentiment. On the other hand, you have the society that does not trust Chinese products in terms of quality. And you have the countries that are already so much dependent on China, like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and Turkmenistan, in terms of debts. And asking China to send vaccines and raising this debt is a very risky thing to do.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I hope we tried to answer this question. So we have another question. It's really big. It's from Mirzahid, and he asks, actually there's a very long, let's say and big text before the question. So let me try to cover it very shortly. You can see it also here in the chat. So he asks about the vaccine diplomacy in multi-vector diplomacy. So how can this play out in the long run for the states, for the small states such as Central Asian states? And here he's saying that this is as Minister Kamilov, if I'm not mistaken, it's Uzbek Minister of Foreign Affairs, recently mused in a meeting with his colleague Lavrov. Either all the population were infected and have recovered, or something else. The number of new infection cases is just 1 per million. Do you agree with this description of small state multi-vector diplomacy is an accurate one? And if so, how this can play out in the long run? Dear colleagues, who would like to answer this question? Maybe Dr. Tweak or Dr. Cooley, or please, up to you.
I'll start just briefly first with the idea that all the population has been infected. Somehow there's not the urgency for vaccination in some of these countries. I'd caution against that. With all of the new variants that are emerging of COVID and the possibility of new waves of the pandemic in places that are currently in a relative lull in new infections, I think there is universal urgency to get vaccines into arms as soon as we possibly can. I think that the perception that Russia is the only option, that Sputnik V is the only option for many Central Asian countries because of the cold chain requirements, the ultra cold temperature requirements, and the cost for Pfizer and Moderna might not be the way this plays out in the long term. The AstraZeneca vaccine is considerably cheaper than Pfizer and Moderna. AstraZeneca is a big part of the COVID or the COVAX portfolio of vaccines and will become much more widely available moving forward as the United States and Western Europe and Canada vaccinate their own populations and start to release some of the pre-purchased doses of that vaccine. And then we're also going to start to see some other vaccines come out from the West. I'm thinking here specifically of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is a one-dose vaccine, relatively inexpensive, does not have the ultra freeze requirements that Pfizer and Moderna do. And importantly, there was just concluded an important agreement between Merck, which doesn't have a vaccine of its own, and Johnson & Johnson, for Merck to enlist its production capacity in making the J&J vaccine. And that's going to increase the production numbers quite dramatically and quite quickly. So I think that the big picture here is that the slate of available vaccines hasn't been completely filled out yet. And we're going to see considerably more available to countries that have affordability and cold chain needs.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Twig. Anyone else who would like to also cover this question? If no, I would like to remind that you can write questions to our speakers here in Zoom's chat or live on Facebook. Please kindly indicate to which speaker you would like to ask a question. We will try to cover all the questions. So here is another question from Miriam. She asks that although the vaccinating did not start in Kyrgyzstan, the numbers of people infected are going down. So do you think that the government of Kyrgyzstan's elite, or maybe all Central Asian states elite, are using the vaccination for their own benefit? So it's a little bit of, let's say, the conspiracy theory or the good question. Who would like to answer this question, since Miriam did not mention the address?
I would say that the number of people infected are going down. It's not only because of the policy. It's not actually because of the policy of the state or the government, but this is just the outcome of age composition of Central Asian countries. Like in Tajikistan, 75% of the population are until 40-year-old. So, I mean, for them, the corona is not so dangerous. So many people already have been infected and recovered. Some of them without noticing, some of them without heavy cases, having heavy case. It means that the number of elderly people who really got infected and even died, and there were a lot of losses, it wasn't so tangible, so visible as in European countries, where the people, I mean, it's 2/3 of the population are above their 40s. So it's totally different situation today. So the reason why infection is going down in Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan is just because the majority of people already, young people, they've been infected and recovered. But it doesn't mean that, as Tajik government says, that there is no COVID anymore. There is still COVID in the society. It's went down, but we expect the third wave in the whole Central Asia, probably in spring, because nothing actually is done to stop, to prevent this a new re-emergence of the COVID in the region. And therefore, I mean, the vaccination could stop, but you see, I mean, people and the ministers in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and other countries, they say that there is no rush. We are not in rush, we can stop, we can think, we can select. And the time is going on, the time is passing, so they losing the momentum. So the outcome could be very serious.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Molajanov. So here's another question from Miriam, and she's asking, are there any cooperation between, for example, China, US, or European Union on vaccination, like testing, for example, the different countries' vaccine, on reporting on the quality, or the countries of Central Asia and other developing world need to go with the most economically viable and maybe better in quality? So who would like to answer this question? Maybe Dr. Cooley or Dr. Twig, or maybe Timur?
I would defer to Dr. Twig on this. She's the global health expert here.
Thank you.
So briefly, we've already seen quite a bit of international cooperation with testing of vaccines developed in one country in a range of other countries. So, you know, we've already noted that there's been testing of some of the Chinese vaccines in some parts of Central Asia. The Sputnik V vaccine has undergone clinical trials in a handful of other countries. In part, this is an imperative of the pandemic itself. When you have countries that already have had many clinical trials on their own soil, they sort of run out of available test populations, and so they need to go to other countries to conduct clinical trials of new vaccines that come under development and need to be tested. I'd like to zero in on this question about having to somehow settle for poorer quality vaccines in some parts of the world or among poorer countries, because we hear this even in the United States, where we started giving the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines first. The reported efficacy of those vaccines is in the 94-95% range, and then the other vaccines that are starting to come online, especially the Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca vaccines, are reported to have overall efficacy in preventing any infection in the 60-70% range. And we're starting to see the evolution of a perceived sort of vaccine quality hierarchy and a fear that the rich white people in the United States are going to get Pfizer and Moderna, and the more disadvantaged racial minority communities in the United States will then be left with a poorer quality Johnson & Johnson or later on, when it's eventually approved, AstraZeneca vaccine. And that fear, I think, plays out globally as well. And I'd just like to caution against that. You know, these numbers for vaccine efficacy, the difference between 94-95% versus 60-70%, the clinical trials that produced those results were carried out among different populations under very different circumstances. I wouldn't put a whole lot of emphasis on the specifics of those numbers, especially when you look at the chart of how well these vaccines prevent severe disease, hospitalization, and death. And they're all coming in at about 100% effective across the board. And so all of these vaccines do what they need, what we need them to do. They prevent serious illness, hospitalization, and death. And so I think we're playing a counterproductive game when we play into perceptions that somehow there are some vaccines that are better than others, that they're all good at doing what we need them to do.
Thank you, Dr. Twig. So we have two more questions, and one is from Ayjan Shasheno, and she's asking, is there information on which sets of vaccines have been approved in Central Asian countries? Without formal approvals, they cannot be available to the general population, even if the governments receive them from the China, Russia, EU, UK COVAX program. Maybe someone has a update or the information about it. Maybe Dr. Mulajanov, I think he touched a little bit.
As I said, that Sputnik is approved in all countries. The Kaz-COVID local in Kazakhstan will be approved when it is delivered. So far, not clear. In Kazakhstan, still discussed. I'm not sure about the Chinese options for Kazakhstan. AstraZeneca actually approved in Kyrgyzstan already officially, Sputnik as well. With regard to China, I'm not sure. There's probably negotiations are going on. The Uzbekistan Sputnik also is approved. The local ZFIUS VAC 2001 vaccine, which actually Uzbekistan has joint authorship, is already registered. They're going to construct to build a factory. Whatever would be produced through COVAX would have organization that would be also approved by local governments. And Tajikistan the same. Whatever they have, they would be approved. So the only case of approval is the Chinese vaccines. They are under question because of the quality, because of opinion poll, because also, as it was mentioned, there are some geopolitical considerations important for local countries. Like for Tajikistan, it's very important not to spoil relationship with the Moscow, not to irritate Moscow too much, because the countries which provide migrants for Russian labor market, they're extremely interested today to open the borders and to send their migrants back to Russia. For them, it's much more important than for the Russians themselves. It's a very key question to them. So they do whatever required. They will do whatever required by Moscow, but to get this final approval. And
thank you, Dr. Molajanov. So I think we have the last question from Kasiet, and she asks, what do you think? Who has won the inner Central Asia COVID-19 related diplomacy, if any? Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan have tried to provide the healthcare related aid. So I would like to also add a small comment to this question. Today we have discussed mainly the foreign vaccines, but we have talked a little bit about the inner Central Asian vaccines. If I'm not mistaken, the Kazakhstan at the early stages, they have tried to do their own vaccine, Uzbekistan as well. So maybe it can be a little bit related to this question. Who do you think in the Central Asia has won this COVID-19 related diplomacy inside of the region? Let's say the leaders of our region, informal leaders, Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. Maybe Timur would like to answer this question, or any other speaker.
I would say that the race is not over yet, and we are maybe even in the beginning of this race, because I'm not an expert on vaccines particularly, but as far as I read in the news, those vaccines are under trial and are not for general rollout yet, even in the countries that are producing these vaccines. So for now, in the short term, we can't say that Russian vaccine is more popular than any other vaccine in the region, and it will be logical to say that Russia is winning, if you want. But in the long term, there are a lot of different options. And as Dr. Twig said, not only from the region itself, but also from Western countries. So I guess this is just the beginning.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So, dear speakers, thank you very much for your contribution to today's discussion and for trying to answer all the questions. I think it was really interesting for everyone, and it brought here together many people from different countries. So I would like to thank our partners from the Oxus Society for their help in organizing this joint event, our dear speakers, and I hope this event will be followed by many different joint projects. For those who missed the start, the video will be available on YouTube soon, and the detailed highlight will be also released on the CABAR website. So let me give a floor to the Regional Director of IWPR in Central Asia, Abahon Sultanazara, for the closing remarks. Dear Abahon.
Thank you very much, Remek. Dear all, really, what an incredible event it was. I had a pleasure, great pleasure listening to all of you. I would like to extend my gratitude to everyone who joined the event today. I would like to thank our panel of experts and the chairs of today's event, Dr. Alexander Kuli, Dr. Judith Twig, Dr. Paliz Molajanov, Timur Umarov, and Edward Lemon and Remek Baysal for facilitating the discussion and raising many important questions. You really gave us a great tour of the issues and challenges around the vaccination and politics around the team, especially in Central Asia. I'm sure that you underlined for us the great importance of being aware and thinking freshly about these problems and possible ways out of them. Our today's discussion, I would say, would not be possible without the great help and support from our valued partner, the Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs. We very much appreciate our partnership and look forward to having more joint events with Oxus Society. I sincerely hope that you join today's discussion. And just for information, please follow our news and join the upcoming events and CABAR Asia, the Central Asia Bureau for Analytical Reporting at www.cabar.asia. Thank you very much for participation.
Thank you, dear Abahon. So, dear friends, let me close on this positive note our discussion and thank everyone for their attention. See you soon and have a good day, good night, wherever you are. Good day. Goodbye.
Thank you very much all.